So I want to move on then in Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus to chapter 5. I'm going to skip chapter 4 on the postulates of linguistics because I don't find linguistics particularly interesting or intellectually satisfying. It's very remote and abstract and not to my taste. But I do want to go over chapter 5 on several different sign regimes. It's called 587 BC to AD 70 on several regimes of signs. And this is the chapter in which what we'll get is basically the equivalent, the closest that we're going to get to the type of thing that was done during the metaphysical epoch, of which Gebser is one of the last belated stragglers, in which he articulates the various consciousness structures. Here we're going to get a postmodern version of the consciousness structures, and D&G call them sign regimes. They're regimes of signifiers. They're semiotic sign regimes, and there are 4 of them, similar to the fact that there are 4 primary consciousness structures in Gebser, in addition to the ever-present origin. In this case, we have 4 sign regimes, in addition to the plane of consistency, which is a kind of a-signifying sign regime, from out of which they emerge and back to which if they de-stratify or the semiotic systems are destroyed, they have to revert back, draw a new diagram with a new abstract machine, and construct a new semiotic. No semiotic, they say, is pure. They're always mixed. All the semiotics are mixed, unlike Gebser with his structures of consciousness and Spengler with his symbols that construct each one of the civilizations. They tend to be very pure, with little admixture of competing structures or symbols. Not so with D&G. The sign regimes are always mixed. There is no such thing, they say, as a pure sign regime. So there are 4 of them. We have the pre-signifying sign regime, which is to say the tribal world, and we have the signifying sign regime, which is basically what comes in with the rise of the state during the Bronze Age, the signifying sign regime. And we have a counter-signifying sign regime, which is the realm of the nomads, the nomadic war machine that works in opposition to the state apparatus. And then we have the post-signifying sign regime, which comes in with the Hebrews, they say, and which continues on down. It's the regime basically of subjectification. Now this builds on the earlier chapter, of course, in Anti-Oedipus, when they had talked about 3 different regimes of representation, which in that case were the primitive territorial regime, which corresponds in this case to the pre-signifying tribal regime, and the barbarian or barbarian despotic regime of representation here now corresponds to the signifying regime, and they're the capitalist regime, which doesn't have an exact correlate here, since it's a mixed semiotic that's mixed with the signifying and the post-signifying regimes. The 2 of them are mixed. Now, before moving into the sign regimes, I want to briefly review, last time we talked about the geology of morals and their metaphysics and how abstract machines work. I briefly want to review that, since one of the hardest parts of D&G is understanding the metaphysics and the ontology that they construct as a kind of canvas, a body without organs, if you will, upon which they construct these ideas as differential flows. And so what we have are, on the plane of consistency, which is the sort of metaphysical realm, which is opposed to and organizes the plane of organization where all the strata take place. What we'll be looking at today is the anthropomorphic stratum, and specifically, remember that every stratum has a double articulation of expression and content. We'll specifically be looking at expression. On the anthropomorphic stratum, content was alloplastic. It was tools, basically, and expression is the various semiotic sign regimes. So we'll be looking at that substratum of the stratum of the anthropomorphic. But what happens is that the abstract machine is something similar to, but not exactly identical with, the Platonic forms, but it's an idea, an organizing function, a machine basically that draws a diagram on the plane of consistency that translates matter and function into substance and expression. And matter here is, despite what the word sounds like, is not material. It does not refer to actual substance. Substance and form, together with expression and content, are something that take place on the plane of organization where all the strata are organized. Each stratum having its own expression and content, and both expression and content, each having its own forms and substances. Substance, they say, is formed matter. By matter, what they mean on the plane of consistency, matter is basically what Deleuze meant in difference in repetition by intensities. These are flows. They're uncoded flows topological stretchings, differential rates of speed, temperature, all these differential flows that are not yet formed, they're not yet coded, and because they're not formed, they have not yet been captured by the strata. And so they basically constitute a body without organs. And so the body without organs is a set of flows that has not been coded. Organs code the body, the same way that they say that the state is an apparatus of capture that codes everything that flows through it. The state is always concerned with coding flows. Taxation is a form of coding the flow of commerce. Slavery is a form of coding human labor. Nowadays, the electric company with its grid codes the electric flow. And so there's always something where a flow is allowed to pass or it's stopped. And so this is the coding process that takes place in all of these different types of formations, these different types of assemblages, which is what they're calling them in this book. In the previous book, they were social formations. In this book, everything becomes an assemblage. And so the abstract machine draws the diagram on the plane of consistency for matter in terms of intensities and continua of intensities that then are translated by machinic assemblages into substances that build the material world, and the functions are translated into the expression language of the various sign regimes that the human being uses to make sense out of the world. And so this is what happens, and the abstract machine is then concerned with organizing equally machinic assemblages of bodies as well as collective assemblages of enunciation, which is to say the realm of signs, the sign regime, the linguistic realm. And so this is what the abstract machine does, and this is how the plane of consistency organizes the strata. And specifically, in this case, the various sign regimes. They're all organized by these abstract machines. So then we have the idea that with the pre-signifying regime, then, this is the tribal regime, each one of these regimes has a different mode, a different way in which statements are made, and a different way in which statements that are made, when plugged into each one of these different sign regimes, takes on a kind of different sense that makes sense within that regime. Each one also has a different kind of faciality. The faciality of the pre-signifying tribal regime is the mask, basically. The face disappears and is hidden by the mask. In the signifying regime, the face of the despot becomes the primary archetype, the central signifier, around which the entire system revolves in a series of concentric radii of the signifiers. And it's a paranoid regime. The face is the central thing about it, and it's a paranoid regime in which the despot is always paranoid and requires a priest to interpret and code the signifiers, to code and decode them, and to translate and defer signifiers into each other, so that the priest is the one who is always in the signifying regime, deferring signifiers through the process of coding and interpretation. And the despot, the despot always wants to know. It's a paranoid regime because he always wants to know, what are the gods planning? How can I avoid offending them? How are my subjects happy? Are they planning revolt? So there's this constant obsessional preoccupation with paranoia that is characteristic of the signifying regime that begins to come in with the Bronze Age. And then we have the pre-signifying tribal regime, and they have this idea that the pre-signifying tribal regime does not ever evolve into the state. The state is an apparatus of capture that has always been, so they deny these evolutionary models. And they say then that the pre-signifying regime proceeds along the construction of a segmentary line through the formation of these clans and tribes and lineages that disrupt, through this constant segmentarization, that disrupt the possibility of the formation of a rigid molar line that then will give rise to a state apparatus. So the way in which the pre-signifying regime is designed is specifically to ward off the social formation of the state. It's designed to resist it, so it never occurs. Whereas the state develops a rigid line of interpretation across which it sometimes sends scapegoats out as these little bundles with packets of signifiers that are sent cutting across all the radii of signifiers and traces out a line of flight off into the desert, as it were. But what can happen then, so we also have, in addition to this, a counter-signifying regime, which is basically the nomads. And the nomads are the war machine. They occupy the realm of smooth space. The state apparatus is built on striated space. It striates the space as it checks all the flows, codes them, checks them, basically uses the earth as a kind of body without organs upon which it constructs the organs of all of these different striations that create a socius that gets the state up and running through coding the flows. Everything is always flowing in Deleuze and Guattari. And so with the counter-signifying regime of the nomads come in and they can destroy the semiotic regimes of the signifying regimes. And if they destroy it, it can destratify and go back down to the plane of consistency where it has to find a new diagram. And in that case, it becomes asignifying. The plane of consistency is asignifying. There are no subjects that form on that plane whatsoever, and a new diagram has to be found, or an abstract machine that will then code for the construction of a new semiotic. Then we have the post-signifying regime. So we have to, so we don't lose track, the pre-signifying, the signifying, the counter-signifying, and now the post-signifying, which they say in this book begins with the Hebrews. And it's basically the regime that has to do with the construction of the subject. And so much of this chapter, a great deal of it, is taken up with a contrast between the paranoid signifying regime and the post-signifying regime, which they call passional, and the contrast between the two of them. The subject never forms in the tribal pre-signifying regime because it's all collective assemblages of enunciation. There are no subjects that form there. The subject begins to come in with the Hebrews, according to them, and this begins to shift into then the subjective passional regime, which is a regime that is based on intense emotions, whereas the paranoid regime, the signifying regime, is always paranoid and requires interpretation. The passional regime does not require interpretation so much, but it's based on intense emotions, hence its passional nature, primarily centering around the idea of betrayal. And so the faciality is the face in profile, in which the face of God is turned away from his subjects. And so we get this idea that everyone in the Old Testament is always tracing out a line of flight. God turns his face away from man and hides it. You can never see the face of God in the Old Testament. Moses is the only one who ever gets a glimpse of it, and when he does so, it deforms him. The impact of God's face actually damages him. So betrayal is fundamental to the post-signifying passional sign regime. It's absolutely fundamental to it. And so we have the idea then that within this regime, as I was going to say also, that with God's face turned away, his subjects like Jonah and Moses and Cain are always trying to trace a line of flight to avoid him. So there's always this, and then we have Jesus and Judas. Jesus on the cross is betrayed by the Father who has abandoned him. This constant obsession and preoccupation with betrayal. And this semiotic goes all the way down into psychoanalysis, where we can see that in the classic form of psychoanalysis, with Freud sitting behind the patient so that the patient lies on the couch and can't see his face, we can see a vestigial echo of this semiotic regime in which the face is turned away, and it's based on this kind of passional betrayal. Now within this regime then, the subject forms, so it has to have a point of, what they call a point of subjectification. And a point of subjectification is what generates the subject. It's basically a kind of fetish. It's a fascinating object or thing that then generates the subject. In the case of the Hebrews, God becomes the point of subjectification. You get a packet of signs, as they put it, which detaches from the paranoid sign regime of the Egyptians, traces a line of flight through the desert, and then its point of subjectification is God himself. Then the subject of enunciation is brought in. Moses, in this case, is the subject of enunciation. God hides his face and he exchanges for it the text, the Ten Commandments. So the book is given in place of the face in this sign regime. Moses brings it down, and then we have also the subject of the statement. These are the Hebrews as a people. So the subject of the statement is always what the discourse in the dominant reality of this regime is about. In the psychotherapeutic tradition, the passional regime, the point of subjectification can be the beloved. He loves me, she loves me. That's the point of subjectification that generates a subject that enters into extreme emotional states, and that generates the subject's love for this other person, then becomes the fascinating fetish. Even they say the anorexic is betrayed by food. Food becomes a point of subjectification that betrays the anorexic. The anorexic betrays food by constantly vomiting it forth. The sexual fetishist, for whom, let's say, the foot becomes the object of fetish, is the point of subjectification that then generates this subject of enunciation, and so forth. So you get the idea that we have these three component aspects of the post-signifying passional regime, which is based on these extreme states, and we have the formation of a subject, a point of subjectification, and anything can become this point, which then generates a subject of enunciation, and then a discourse. The subject of the statement, which is basically the discourse within which everything that is discoursed about, or the primary fascination, the point of subjectification that is discoursed about, forms the dominant reality of this regime. With Descartes, we get, for example, the point of subjectification in his case is the infinite, and of course the cogito then becomes the subject of enunciation, and the subject of the statement becomes the soul's relationship to the body. So we have the formation of the subject there with Descartes.